Greetings, brethren. You probably remember that back in 2017, in the month of May, I visited the city of Jerusalem, and I was a participant of the conference related to the House of Israel and the House of Judah. Of course, various speakers presented all kinds of things. My topic was Dan's Serpent Trail, and my speech did generate quite a great interest in the audience. However, I lost my notes, and even though my speech was recorded, sadly, I have never gotten the recording or the audio file. Many of you expressed your interest in the speech and what did I say, so I thought that I might indeed now, based on these notes that I have, reconstruct and give you the speech anyway. The speech was delivered in Cinematheque, the cinema house that is in Jerusalem, on May 22nd, 2017. I remember that it was Monday, and I remember that on that very day, the whole city was kind of sealed off because the then president, US President Donald Trump, was on his visit to the Holy Land. And I spoke in my speech about the route of migration of the tribes of Israel, and that's exactly what Dan's Serpent Trail was and is. Dan's Serpent Trail was a prophecy about the wandering Israel, where it will go, and it will to be the waymark through which we could trace down the lost house of Israel, which was expelled from the Holy Land by the Assyrians onto the shores of the Black Sea. So, finally, I can indeed bring you this joy by delivering this speech of mine that stirred up quite a great interest and praises by the audience. The audience was a mixed crowd of the Jews and other people from various other lands who consider themselves to be the lost ones, the lost Israelites who they believe found their true identity. Unlike any other river in the world, brethren, Danube flows through 10 countries. Danube's original name was Ishtar, named after Easter. It comes from a pagan goddess in whose honor the so-called Christianity today celebrates its pagan Easter. It was customary for the tribe of Dan to name toponyms after their forefather. Now the Bible also prophesied that Dan was to leave a serpent trail which the house of Israel followed as it migrated northwest from the Holy Land. The prophecy about Dan is given in the very first book of the Bible. So in Genesis 49, Jacob summoned his 12 sons at his deathbed, and King James translation of verse 1 says, "And Jacob called unto his sons, and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days." Please, brethren, note this, in the last days. And this is the correct translation of the original Hebrew, in the last days. That means the prophecies in Genesis 49 are for our days. Jacob prophesied what his descendants would be fulfilling in these last days. In verse 16, Jacob prophesied that in these last days, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Now this means that Dan was to have equal status, even though his mother is Bilhah, a handmaid, not a wife of Jacob. According to Strong's Concordance, judge can mean to rule, or to strive as at law, or plead the cause. Now verses 17 and 18, they say that Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that bites the horse heels, so that the rider shall fall backward. Now in type, Samson did judge and avenge his people against the Philistines. In Judges chapter 13, verse 2, we have the account of Samson's parents, which shows that Samson was a descendant of the tribe of Dan. It says, "And there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren." And of course she gave birth to Samson. Now Samson's guerrilla tactics, brethren, of warfare were successful for the small against the big, and the few against the many, like a serpent that makes a rider fall by biting the horse's heels. The tribe of Dan was also small, and there were few, so they needed to be cunning In the sense of rulers, the Irish have become judges in disproportionate numbers to their population. Consider that of those who signed the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, 4 were Irish and 9 of Irish descent. Also, brethren, keep in mind that Irish Americans feature prominently in all aspects of economic, professional, and political life. Many people of Irish descent have made distinguished contributions to public life of Anglo-Saxon nations. For example, of the 7 prime ministers who came to power in Australia between 1929 and 1949, 6 were of Irish descent. We find this in a publication entitled Ireland in Brief by the Department of Foreign Affairs, fact sheet January 1986, page 16. Also 10 of early American presidents, Jackson Polk, Grant, Wilson, Buchanan, Andrew Johnson, Arthur Cleveland, Harrison, and McKinley, they were of Protestant Northern Irish descent. You can find it in the book Ireland, written by Lillian Fox Quigley, page 109. Also, American President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was Irish. So was the current president at that time, when I delivered this speech, Donald J. Trump. Now, in the sense of Irishmen who have pleaded the cause of defendants or plaintiffs by striving at the law, many Irishmen became lawyers, and being highly dramatic and favored with oratorical powers or provers, many young men used this talent well. That's also written in the book written by Lillian Fox Quigley. Many Irishmen also have become policemen or judges to such an extent that it was proverbial in the United States to associate the name O'Reilly or Malloy with neighborhood policemen. Well, perhaps, it would be also within the framework of this prophecy to say that writers plead the cause and give a judgment as well. And you see in the book Fodor's Essential Ireland, published in 1987, page 53, it says that Ireland has produced a disproportionately large number of internationally famous authors for a country of her size. Such names as James Joyce, George Bernard Shaw, William Butler Yeats, Oscar Wilde, Samuel Beckett are just the top of the list. Now, behind also many inventions are the talents of the Irish brethren. Robert Fulton made steam, navigation, and reality. Cyrus Hall McCormick invented the farm implement which developed the West, a mechanical reaper. Rubber heels were invented by Humphrey O'Sullivan. The hurricane lamp used by railroad men was the invention of Michael Hicks. And you can again find it in the book written by Lillian Fox Quigley, Ireland, page 107. Now, Dan has also judged and ruled his people in politics, the legal profession, literature, law enforcement, business, and inventions. Rachel was correct when she said in Genesis 30, verse 6, God has judged me and has heard my voice and has given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. Now the question, how have the Irish been a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider shall fall backward, as it is prophesied in Genesis 49, verse 17. Well, brethren, please consider the following facts. And those are that Dan introduced idolatry into the land, into the promised land of Israel on a regular official basis. Please see the account in Judges 18, verses 30 and 31, where we read the following. And the children of Dan set up the graven image. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land, which means until the Assyrians invaded the land and took the Israelitish tribes and the Israelite nations captive. And they set them up Micah's graven image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. So there was a house of God in Shiloh where Israelites would go for worship, and there was this image, a graven image that the Danites were worshipping in their own land. And it was also in Dan that Jeroboam, who led the rebellion of the house of Israel against the house of Judah, he set up one of his 2 golden calves, as recorded in 1 Kings chapter 12. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 28 and 29, we read, Whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And he said to the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. And this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. So it became sin for the whole house of Israel, brethren. Now furthermore, we find that Dan had a Levite, so-called priest, who was also called a father, who dressed in an ephod and used idols in worship. Judges 18, verse 19 and 20. And they said unto him, Hold thy peace, lay thine hand upon thy mouth, and go with us, and be to us a father and a priest. Is it better for thee to be a priest unto the house of one man, or that thou be a priest unto a tribe and a family in Israel? And the priest's heart was glad, and he took the ephod and the teraphim and the graven image, and went in the midst of the people. Well, even today, as we know, about 95% of the population of Ireland are Roman Catholics. And they have their earthly father, under quotation mark, father in Rome. They have their Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, and he is right there in Rome. Now we also see in the serpent and adder symbolism. In that symbolism we see an allusion to guerrilla warfare of Irish. You see, Irish history is indeed full of violence of this kind. Irish liberation from British rule was achieved as a result of struggle extending over several centuries and marked by numerous rebellions. On Easter Monday, April 24th, 1917, Sinn Féin became the most influential political party in Ireland. In January 1919, the Sinn Féin members of Parliament assembled in Dublin, proclaiming the independence of Ireland. And there followed guerrilla attacks by Irish insurgents, later called the Irish Republican Army, IRA, on British forces. The warfare against the British continued until July 10th, 1921, when a truce was arranged. Now, ratification of a peace treaty brought into being the Irish Free State. An increase in violence between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland was followed by IRA terrorist activity in the Irish Republic. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the Irish government faced increased domestic terrorism by extremist Irish nationalists, resulting in large part from the collapse of representative government in Northern Ireland and the reimposition there of direct British rule. Now, all the facts you can find in Fang and Wagnalls, volume 14, on pages 227 and beyond. Now, Dan is often listed, brethren, last in any tribal listings. When I say tribal listings, of course, I mean the tribes of the house of Israel. The example of them being listed last is in Numbers 10, verse 25. However, in Joshua 19, verse 47 through 49, we find the custom of Danites to name toponyms after their forefather. And that is what is very relevant for Dan's serpent trail. Because Joshua 19, verse 47, it says, And the coast of the children of Dan went out too little for them. Therefore the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem, and took it, and smote it with the edge of the sword, and possessed it, and dwelt therein, and called Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan their father. So after the name of Dan their father, they would rename various toponyms. That's how they renamed the river of Danube. It was called Ishtar previously, and then they renamed it and called it the Danube. Now Dan is also omitted in the genealogies of 1 Chronicles, chapter 2 through chapter 10. We have various genealogies. And Dan is completely omitted because of Dan's idolatry and his treacherous guerrilla warfare. In fact, just as anciently, the Assyrian invasion of the modern Israelite nations may come indeed, brethren, from Ireland, because Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 16 and 17 says the following. The snorting of his horses was heard from Dan. For they are come and have devoured the land, and all that is in it, the city and those that dwell in it. For behold, I will send serpents, cockatrices among you, which will not be charmed, and they shall bite you, says the Eternal. So perhaps, this is very probable, the Irish will betray the English to the German-led Europe. And all this invasion comes from the north in the book of Jeremiah, north of the promised land, of course. When you look at the north, it will be a combine of nations and kingdoms of the north. It's written in chapter 1, and today is the Sabbath day, and in my native tongue we're going to analyze chapter 1 of the book of Jeremiah. So this combine of nations is coming out of the north, from the north of the Holy Land. North, if you walk north of the Holy Land, you go straight into Europe and various ancient and modern kingdoms of Europe. It is also important now to understand, as we are now speaking of the Old Testament, that not all Danites entered the Promised Land, brethren. In Genesis 46, verse 23, we see that Dan moved to Egypt with one son, Hushim, who was also known as Shuham, in Numbers 26, verse 42 and 43. So Dan had one land, and two of Shuham's descendants were called Danaus and Cadmus. Greek history tells us that Danaus and Cadmus fled from Egypt, and they arrived in Greece at the same time as the exodus of Israelites under Moses from Egypt. You find this in History of the World, written by Petanius. Now, in the publication Fasti Hellenici, the Greek chronology, it says that Cadmus' expedition occurred 310 years before the fall of Troy, which was in 1183 before Christ. Now, that places Cadmus' expedition to 1493 before Christ, the very year of the Exodus, or very near to the Exodus. Now, in the 6th century before Christ, one of the writers, Hecataeus of the Abdera, he confirms that the most distinguished of the expelled foreigners from Egypt followed Danaus and Cadmus into Greece, but the greater number were led by Moses into Judea. Now, some Danites also lived on ships at the Mediterranean coast in the Promised Land. We see that in Judges chapter 5, verse 17, which says that a portion of the tribe of Dan remained in ships. So they didn't go into the land, they didn't build the houses, they remained on the ships. Judges 5:17, it says, Gilead abode beyond Jordan, and why did Dan remain in ships? Now those ship dwellers sailed away and eventually reached Ireland. They didn't wait for the invasion of the Assyrians. Once the Assyrian invasion began, they sailed away, went to the island, and those Danites who lived in the Holy Land, they needed, you see, more land. And we have just seen a minute ago how Dan leapt forward into the territory as he was making his trail on the continent. So he was making his trail on the continent, and then he also made his trail across the seas, brethren. In Deuteronomy 33, verse 22, we have the prophecy of Moses about the tribe of Dan. It says, Dan is a lion's whelp. He shall leap from Bashan. And this, of course, occurred in type when in Judges 18, verse 1, the Danites sought an inheritance to dwell in. And what they did, they made a leap from the northern Bashan area and attacked Laish like a lion's whelp would. We read about that in Judges 18, verse 27 and 28. And they took the things which Micah had made, and the priest which he had, and came unto Laish, unto a people that were at quiet and secure. And they smote them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Zidon, and they had no business with any man. And it was in the valley that lies by Bithrehob, and they built a city and dwelt therein. So you see, then they dwelt there, and then they changed the name of the city to Dan, as it says in verse 29. Later on, brethren, Dan made another leap from Bashan to Greece and Spain and Ireland and Denmark. He put his name in these places as well. And those Danites who were exiled to the shores of the Black Sea also marked various toponyms on their way on the continent. On their way to northwest Europe, they left that Serpent trail of which Danube is a part. The tribes of Israel migrated along Danube on their way northwest. Many Israelites remained behind and mixed with other nations, including the Serbian nation. By the way, brethren, the banks of Danube are the most beautiful in Serbia, and you can check that on YouTube presentation and perhaps other presentations you can find on this beautiful river. In fact, the most beautiful river beach, in whole of Europe is located in the city of Novi Sad in northern Serbia. And, interestingly enough, there has never been a pogrom in Serbia It is one of the few nations which did not participate in the Holocaust. The Holocaust in Serbia was committed by the occupiers who partitioned the land and also committed a genocide against the Serbian people, as well as the Holocaust of the Jews. Now, in Serbia, we also have the marks of Dan, you see, because the original name of the Serbian capital, Belgrade, is Singidunum. My hometown, Užice, was called Kapedunum, and this characteristic dun expression is found on the British Isles as well, such as Dundalk, Dundrum, Dunglow, Dungraven, or Dunsmore, the Don River in Scotland and in England, as well as the river Doon in Scotland. Now, when the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser invaded the northern kingdom of Israel in 741 before Christ, as mentioned in 2 Kings 15 verse 20, there is no mention of Dan being invaded, you see. Naphtali, Gilead, and Galilee are all mentioned, so this indicates that the Danites migrated by sea. However, there were Danites on the continent as they formed the Serpent Trail. We see the proof of that in the Greek history as well. As for the Danites who went to Judea, they received a very small allotment of land, so Joshua gave them permission to expand beyond the borders of Canaan. So they went up the Jordan Valley and settled first at Laish. After a while they moved on to Smyrna and then to Greece. And they thus marched out of Bible history because God's eyes are on this land, and the Bible is the record of the Holy Land. So you see, brethren, when God's people take when they take different routes out of the land, and when God also takes people out of His sight, the phrase simply means away from the Holy Land. Now, interestingly enough, unlike other Israelites, most of the Danites did not go into Assyrian captivity. The bulk of that tribe had left the Holy Land before the time of the Israelite king Jeroboam II, as they do not appear in the genealogy of 1 Chronicles chapter 5. And these Danites attacked their kinsmen, the Zarahites, the descendants of the Judah's son Zara, they lived in Troy, and the Danites actually fought the Trojan War, as many people may not realize. They became the ruling people in Greece and were the Danai of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Now Herodotus, who is also called in Europe the father of the history, of the science of history, he tells us that the Lacedaemonians, who are actually Spartans, were in his day the most powerful and eminent branch of the Dorian Greeks. He also says that Lacedaemonians were the most learned of the Greeks. The Lacedaemonians, they wore a linen tunic, he says, with a fringe hanging around the legs, and their religious customs forbid wearing wool in a temple. They have no dealings with strangers. The Lacedaemonians were kindred with the house of Heracles in Sparta, who was actually Samson the Danite. Now the Greek Danaoi and the Irish Tuatha De Danaans, they're mentioned in the history. Tuatha De Danaan simply means the tribe of Dan. In the book The History of Ireland, written by Thomas Moore, he says that the Irish bards tell us the following about the tribe of Dan. The Tuatha De Danaan, after sojourning sometime in Greece, set sail for Ireland. The Psalter of Cashel confirms this by saying the Tuatha De Danaans ruled in Ireland for about 2 centuries and were highly skilled in architecture and other arts from their long residence in Greece and their intercourse with the Phoenicians. End of the quote. In Juventus Mundi, William Gladstone testifies that the Tuatha De Danaan from Ireland, that they came from the Danai of Greece. And those Danites who were captured in the northern kingdom of Israel, along with other Israelites, they were resettled around the Black Sea. And of course it is no coincidence that rivers emptying into the Black Sea had various names. After the exiled Israelites were driven there by the Assyrians, those rivers were renamed, and so today we find in that area Danube, Dniester, the Dnieper, and Don. Now, Stephen Collins, one of the greatest modern historians, points out that these Danites would have migrated into Europe when the Scythians and Parthians were pushed into Europe in later centuries. That is, the Dan's brethren Serpent trail that was followed by the tribes of Israel. Which means that, of course, through the river of Danube, they sailed across the continent to northwest Europe. So those tribes also, whether they sailed or whether they migrated on foot, but nevertheless they were moving along the river Danube. So those tribes migrated along Danube, and the Israelites migrated following the names of the tribe of Dan throughout history. So those names are like a snake path in the desert. And that is how we can trace down the so-called lost house of Israel today. Now, the Eternal intended that lost, so-called lost Israel, was to be located in these last days, in our days. So, of course, no wonder that we have very precise knowledge of their identity today. Now, how do we trace them down? Well, by the signs or waymarks that have remained along the trail by which ancient Israel journeyed after its exile from the Holy Land. About those waymarks, there was a prophecy. God prophesied that it would be that way. In Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 21, that scripture tells Ephraim, the leader of the 10 tribes, to leave those waymarks along the way of their migration. Now, Ephraim was the leader, and when you say the word Ephraim, it implies all the tribes of Israel. Now, the tribe of Dan was specifically prophesied through their father Jacob that they would leave that trail, and that the other Israelites would follow the serpent's trail. In Jeremiah 31:21, it says, "Set thee up waymarks, make thee high heaps. Set thine heart toward the highway, even the way which thou wantest." End of the quote. And here is, I'll give you now more modern translation. It says, "Set up road signs, put guideposts. Take note of the highway, the road that you take." We also read that the prophecy of Dan, it says that Dan shall be a serpent by the way. Another translation of the original Hebrew is this: Dan shall be a serpent's trail. A serpent's trail. In Judges 18, verse 11 and 12, it is recorded the Danites took Kiriath Jearim and called that place Machanech Dan unto this day. And later they captured the city of Laish, and they called the name of the city Dan after the name of Dan their father. It says in verse 29. So that is how Danites actually left their serpent's trail, the waymarks by which we trace today the lost, so-called lost Israel. Along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, when they were sailing toward Ireland, they also, brethren, left their trail in Den, Don, and Din. In Ireland we find their waymarks like Danslow, Dansower, Dundalk, Dundrum, Donegal, Donegal City, Dunglo, Dingle, Dunsmore meaning more dance, and moreover the name Dun in the Irish language today means the same as Dan in the Hebrew. It means judge. Now, the northern colony of Danites, those who did not live in ships, that northern colony was taken to Assyria in the captivity. And after leaving Assyrian captivity, they inhabited the land around the Black Sea. Then we find other waymarks along the way, such as Danau or Danube, the Dan-in, the Danaster, the Dandari, the Danes, the Danzig, the Udon, the Eridon, all the way down to the Danes. Denmark, the name of the country of Denmark means Dan's mark. Very obvious. When they came to the British Isles, they set up the waymarks I have already mentioned. So, brethren, the serpent's trail of Dan sets up waymarks that lead directly to the British Isles. Now, the Israelites who settled on the British Isles have been used by the Eternal to fulfill another important Bible prophecy which involves the house of Judah. Because Judah had 2 sons by his daughter-in-law Tamar. And, those 2 sons were named Phares and Zara. Both could claim to be the firstborn, and consequently, because they were twins, They both established royal lines, but not in the same place, because you cannot have two monarchs in one place or on one throne. So the proof that they were sons of Judah lay in the signet, which was actually a ring, and bracelets that are mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 10, and staff of Judah that he gave to Tamar as a pledge in Genesis 38:18. Let's read Genesis 38:18. And he said, Judah said to Tamar, "What pledge shall I give thee?" And she said, that is, "Thy signet, and thy bracelets, and thy staff that is in thine hand." And he gave it to her, and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. Now you may wonder, why does the British Royal Coronation Service use these three items plus the scepter? Well, it is indeed the scepter from Genesis 49 verse 10, where Jacob prophesied to his son Judah that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh, or that is Messiah, until Messiah come, and unto him, unto the Messiah, shall the gathering of the people be. Of course, this is prophecy of Jesus Christ. In Genesis 46 verse 12 and verse 26, we also see that Zerah had no children when he went down into Egypt with his grandfather Jacob, but his twin brother Phares was accompanied by two sons, Hezron and Hamul. You see that in Genesis 46 verse 12 and verse 26. Now, Zerah's sons and his grandsons are mentioned also in 1 Chronicles chapter 2 verse 6, 7 and 8, and also in 1 Kings chapter 4 verses 30 and 31. They're mentioned as the Ezrahite, in effect Zerahite, and Heman and Kalkol and Darda, the sons of Mahol. So it's all in 1 Kings chapter 4. But brethren, the biblical genealogy of Zerah ends with this third generation, indicating the departure of Zerah's line from Israel while Israel was in Egypt. And the question is, where did they go? Well, the history tells us. Kalkol established Zaragoza, meaning the stronghold of Zerah, which is now called Saragossa, in the Ebro Valley in Spain. In Camden's Historia Britannica, we find that Kalkol sailed from Egypt to Spain, and from Spain to Ireland, where he established Ulhad, which is Ulster. The Irish Book of Conquests points to these Iberians, or, also called Firbolgs, as being the earliest inhabitants of Ireland. They called the land Iberne, which was later abbreviated to Erne, then Erin, and then later it was Latinized to Hibernia or Hibernia, however you would pronounce that, but it's more natural to me, Hibernia. Hibernia, of course, that was all the names of Ireland. Now, in pre-Exodus days, Abraham's descendants were still called Hebrews, as we see in Exodus chapter 2, verse 6 and verse 13. They were also called Heberites, as recorded in Numbers chapter 26, verse 45. So thus the Iberi, who came to Ireland about 1,700 before Christ, those who came from Iberi from the Ebro River in Iberia, they must be, of course, Hebrews. They also gave their name to the Hebrides Islands, and also they gave their name to Eboracum, which was later called York. Now, other cities in Wales and Scotland also are prefixed by the letters Aber or Uber. In his work, John Dunham Massey states that there is evidence also that Hebrew was spoken almost all over Ireland at a very early period, as ancient inscriptions in that language have been unearthed not only on the coast but even in the very center of the country. Now, Ulster, or Northern Ireland, has even to this day the heraldic symbol of a red hand circled by a scarlet cord. Why is that? Well, that is because of the incident in Genesis 38, verse 28, where Zerah put his hand out of the womb, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, "This came out first." But he pulled back his hand into the womb, and his brother Phares actually came out first. In Genesis 49 verse 10 we read that the scepter, or we can more precisely define it, the blessing of the scepter was given to both Zara and Phares. And later in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 16, this scepter was given forever to the Phares line of David's house. However, we also read in scriptures such as 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 4, Jeremiah chapter 33 verses 17 through 26, and Psalm 89th Psalm verses 3 and 4. These scriptures establish that David's throne unconditionally is there forever. So that David's throne, which was, David is the descendant of Phares, so the throne that was established by Phares, and later confirmed by his, or established by his descendants from David onward, that throne is established unconditionally forever by the Holy Scriptures. So that means that throne must exist today. And also many people overlook in the Bible that before Jesus was born, an angel told Mary of his destiny in Luke chapter 1, verse 32 and 33, and this was a prophecy, brethren, as well. Speaking of Jesus, Luke 1:32, "He shall be great," said angel Gabriel to Mary, "and shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall rule or reign over the house of Jacob forever." Well, brethren, we know that Jesus Christ, when he came the first time, did not become a monarch and did not sit on David's throne. David's throne in Jerusalem was established by the Phares line. But Zara was not excluded from the rulership of blessing, because the Babylonian destruction of the house of Judah came as prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah. And that prophet was spared from going into captivity, as we read in Jeremiah chapter 43. In Jeremiah 43 verses 5 through 7, we read that the king's daughters and Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch came into the land of Egypt. So they escaped the captivity by the Babylonians. Now it was the man called Flinders Petrie, and his excavations in Egypt discovered the very house where Jeremiah stayed with the two daughters of the last Jewish king, King Zedekiah. That house is in Taphnis. That house is in the city of Taphnis, which was the border city. And it has retained to our time the name of the house of the Jew's daughter. The Eternal, however, warned Jeremiah that Babylon's king would soon overrun Egypt also and destroy the remnant of Judah there. So in Jeremiah 44 verse 28 we see that the prophet, his scribe Baruch, and king's daughters had to move away. There were two daughters, by the way. Now we have no time to go through, at least not in this message, but you have got my lectures, let's call them that way, sayings, lectures, utterances, whatever you want to call them, my messages. In my other messages you can find various intertwined prophecies in the Bible about the throne of David being replanted in the land of lost Israel, in fact the land inhabited by the tribe of Dan. We mentioned it's not Denmark, but it is the tribe of Dan settled, as we read, as the first settlers in Ireland, you see. And therefore, since to save the time, we'll just review the end results. The end result is that the ancient chronicles of Ireland inform us that a sage, a wise man named Olam Fodla, meaning wonderful prophet, came from Egypt by way of Spain about 6 centuries before the Christian era, and that he landed on the northeast coast of Ireland, where the town of Carrickfergus is now. He brought with him a princess called Tamar Tefi, the tender, which means the tender or palm beautiful in Hebrew, and he also brought his secretary named Bruch. Now, of course, Irish poetry identifies Olam Fodla as Jeremiah and Tamar Tefi as the daughter of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. It is also claimed that Tamar Tefi's younger sister, Scotta, never reached Ireland due to the fact that in Spain she married a Celto-Scythian prince named Milesius. Now, Tamar Tefi married the Irish king called Eochaid Heremon of the Zara's branch of Judah, and so the two lines became united. The line of Phares of which Tamar was descendant, and the line of Zerah, of which Eochite Heremon was a descendant. Jeremiah and his company came on a ship belonging to the Iberian Danaan, and brought with them a rough stone and a large mysterious chest. On the forecourts at Dublin today, which is actually the Supreme Court of Ireland, you will find a statue of the prophet Jeremiah. And to this very day, Jeremiah's burial place is pointed out on the Devonish Island. All that you can do is just type into Google Jeremiah's tomb, and you'll find it's there on the Devonish Island. And it has been known through the centuries that, Devonish Island, it has been known through the centuries as Jeremiah's tomb. Now, from the marriage of Heremon and Teatefi came a long line of Irish monarchs. The Scotch monarchs were descended from the Irish kings. The last Scottish king, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England, and that is, brethren, the origin of the current British monarch. Now, King Heremon and Queen Tamar Tefi, they were crowned at Tara Hill, in Hebrew we can call it Torah Hill, upon the Ida File, the coronation stone of Israel, just as the kings of Judah had been for centuries, as it is of course recorded in the Chronicles and the Kings in the Old Testament. It was at this time that the harp of David became part of the royal heraldic symbolism, since David was the farthest line, and it is to this day a symbol of Ireland. Now, how amazing indeed is the history of the tribe of Dan, brethren, whose serpent's trail has remained with us to this day. And before I close this message, I think I owe it to the tribe of Dan and to all Israel a reflection on their imminent future. And that was indeed a strong message which I later in discussion and in the question and answer sessions reiterated and gave a strong warning to all the Jews and all those others gathered from around the nations, again in that warning about the coming punishment in our times that is coming upon the entire house of Israel. So what I said in Jerusalem over 4 years ago was this: based on the pivotal Old Testament prophecy in Leviticus 26, the prophets warned the ancient house of Judah and the ancient house of Israel of their downfall as the result of breaking the commandments of God given through Moses. Lamentations tell about the total destruction of Judah and Jerusalem at the hands of Babylonians. When that happened, the house of Israel had already been into captivity for 136 years. Ezekiel was the prophet to the house of Israel. He was also the prisoner of war in a Babylonian camp. So his message to already lost house of Israel could not be delivered at that time. Thus, I pointed out in Jerusalem, Ezekiel's message has remained a warning to the modern house of Israel. Due to its lawlessness, violation of Torah, a whole-scale destruction is coming to the modern house of Israel. Psalm 83 lists the nations which are currently plotting to destroy both houses of Israel. In verse 4 and 5, those enemies say, "Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance, for they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee," against the entire house of Israel, the modern house of Israel. Jeremiah warns us of the impending time of Jacob's trouble. It is the trouble of Jacob's modern descendants coming as a punishment from the eternal because of their breaking the law of God. However, the later restoration of Israel is also prophesied. Bible predicts the future kingdom of Israel as a model nation. A part of the house of Israel has already returned to this land. Of course, brethren, various Jews, not all the Jews, but many Jews have returned to the land. They're preparing now the way for the return of the rest of the Israelites. Following Jacob's trouble, I pointed out in Jerusalem, the outcasts of the house of Israel will also return to dwell in peace and mutual respect with their brothers, the Jewish people. When Abraham entered this land, I said this land because I was at that time in Jerusalem, the Eternal told him in Genesis 12, verse 7, "Unto thy seed will I give this land." Jacob and his descendants are Abraham's seed. Regardless of evil plots by those who hated the Jewish people and the modern house of Israel, this land, I meant, of course, the land in which I was against the land of Israel. The Holy Land will remain forever in the hands of Jewish people. Because Jewish people are very sensitive. I made that comment knowing that Jewish people are very sensitive about their land. They now have their own state, their own land, in which they can feel freedom and safety. And thus, to comfort them, regardless of the fact that that country is going to be occupied by the German-led Europe and conquered, I wanted to give them some consolation as well as to the others. And that's why I made the comment that this land will remain forever in the hands of Jewish people. But I also added, once the Jacob's trouble is over, this beautiful city, Jerusalem, will become the capital of the world to come. And later I also pointed out that, Jerusalem will be the capital of all of Israel, in the restored kingdom of Israel, ruled by the resurrected David. And of course I pointed out that, it will remain their land forever, as it has been prophesied in Genesis. The prophecy in Jeremiah, I also pointed out to my audience. The prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 17, 18 and 19 says, "At that time they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of the Lord. No longer will they follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts. In those days the people of Judah will join the people of Israel, and together," and I underline this, together, "they will come from a northern land to the land I gave your ancestors as an inheritance. I myself said, how gladly would I treat you like my children and give you a pleasant land, the most beautiful inheritance of any nation. I thought you would call me Father and not turn away from following me."